Why did Russia break the grain deal? What is it really going for? Does this mean that Ukrainian ports will again be blocked? But after all, during the time while the agreement worked, Kyiv and Washington came up with a plan B. We learned exclusive details about it. Will it happen to avoid problems, blockade and world hunger? Let's answer these questions together. I'm Alexey Matsuka. Let's go. Russia again returns to the language of ultimatums after Russia announced that it was suspending its participation in the Grain Export Initiative. Not a single ship carrying Ukrainian food could move to exactly the same day. Those who were already at sea stood in the roadstead. Those who were ongoing loading in ports remained there. And this is the failure of contracts, violation of deadlines, and in the future an increase in prices on world markets which instantly react to such emergencies. All this, according to the data confirmed by United Nations Secretariat, by that moment 21 ships with a total capacity of 700,000 tons carrying grain were in Ukrainian ports or near them, including this particular one, the bug carrier Icaria Angel, chartered by the World Food Programme, in the holds of which there are more than 30,000 tons of wheat. That's intended for African countries suffering from hunger. Then all of a sudden there were reports that the humanitarian window would open, but only for one day, on the last day of November. Some of the ships will be examined and let through, but everyone will definitely not make it in time, because the line is already made up of more than 100 ships and it's getting longer and longer. Is that really it? The end? Will the export process be blocked? If this does happen, the consequences for the planet as whole would be very serious, the US National Security Council warned.
Russia is again trying to use the war it started as a pretext for weaponizing food, directly impacting nations in need and global food prices, and exacerbating already dire humanitarian crisis and food insecurity. Adrienne Watson, US National Security Council spokeswoman.
What is Moscow going for? After all, pay attention, Russia uses a streamlined wording, suspension of the deal. They say they didn't quite leave it, but in fact they broke the agreements. They put everything on pause without a clear intention to discuss any new conditions yet. And here in my high offices there is an assumption that all the latest steps taken by the Kremlin, including statements about a possible nuclear strike, atomic test over the sea, the infamous dirty bomb, or now about a suspension of grain export, are forced negotiation attempts. An attempt to create so many artificial problems that at some point the West, and primarily the United States, would agree a direct dialogue with Russia. Perhaps in some format during the G20 in Bali. Let it not be tete-a-tete, but a wide circle. But Moscow's intentions are to start negotiations, to make some contact, under this pretext to achieve, if not a truce, then a freeze or hostilities for a while negotiations are underway. To talk about nothing, but during this time prepare the mobilized force and pull up reserves, prepare the defenses in the occupied south of Ukraine. And winter just around the corner. And from Russian officials, this hint sounds already direct.
We should return to the state of December-January and ask the question: what the Russians are offering may not suit us all, but maybe it's still worth sitting down with them at the negotiation table. Dmitry Peskov, Putin's press secretary.
Or here is a statement from Lavrov on the same topic but in different wording.
We are ready to talk with the West to reduce tensions, but only if there are realistic proposals based on equal approaches. Sergei Lavrov, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia.
A high-ranking old-school diplomat who worked during the Cold War between the US and the USSR told me that all Soviet diplomacy was reduced to artificially increasing tensions and then trying to bargain for what Moscow needs in negotiation to decrease tensions. So now they might be using the same logic, and even the terms are the same from the old days. And if this is so, then it's really unprofitable for Moscow to completely withdraw from the deal, rather than suspend it and bargain every day. We agree on the passage of ships. We don't agree on the passage of ships, which in fact is happening. And here it's necessary to understand how important the Istanbul Grain deal for the EU and the United States. Where and in what volumes did the grain go while the agreement was still working? According to the United Nations, by the time Moscow suspended the grain deal, more than 9.5 million tons of grain and food had already been transported from Ukraine ports as part of the deal. Here, in fact, we are talking about not only about wheat, but also about corn and sunflower oil. How much will hang up if the sea trade route freezes? Having received a new harvest, Kyiv planned to constantly increase the volumes. 3 million tons in September, 4 million in October, even more in November and December. And these plans were even exceeded. It's enough to say that 89 grain carriers from all over the world signed up to join the initiative at the slightest opportunity and also get on the line. Is it true that this process brought down world food prices? Yes, it is. Statistics clearly demonstrate this. In October, the prices fell by almost 10%. But every time when there is uncertainty whether Ukrainian export will last or not, prices jump on a wave of a panic again.
The Black Sea Grain Initiative has already brought prices down around the world, which has been critically important for low and middle-income countries. It has been a success and must continue. Any act by Russia to disrupt these critical grain exports is essentially a statement that people and families around the world should pay more for food or go hungry. Antony Blinken, US Secretary of State.
But is there any truth in the accusation from the Kremlin that they say food is sent allegedly not to the places negotiated for? Yes, there are certain statistics, but it's all about how to interpret them. Let me explain. The UN data does show that the largest volumes, at least initially, were sent from Ukraine to Spain, Turkey, Italy, China and the Netherlands. For example, in September, about 30% of food went to the poorest countries and about 40% went to high-income countries. But in the Office of Sanctions Coordination of the United States Department, they explained to us that these figures don't show anything by themselves. And that's why.
The first thing that had to happen was that a bunch of ships that were stuck in the port had to leave. Those ships were being held hostage because Russia had stopped all shipping in that part of the Black Sea. So those ships had to leave. They just wanted to go home, so they were sent away. But now we are starting to see Ukrainian wheat from the latest harvest go to market, and that increasingly, again, it goes to the global south. Jim O'Brien, the head of the Office of Sanctions Coordination, US Department of State.
According to the African Development Bank, there is a shortage of 30 million tons of food on the continent. Food prices in Africa have risen by 40%. In Nigeria, the cost of pasta and bread has increased by 50%. In Yemen, which used to import more than 1 million tons of wheat from Ukraine a year, flour prices have increased by more than 40% and bread prices by a quarter. In Syria, where Ukrainian wheat was also constantly purchased. The price of bread doubled. Therefore, worried forecasts about global famine come to mind. If the grain deal cannot be resumed or unfrozen, this would not be an exaggeration. Based on this, many analysts see in Moscow's actions also a desire to provoke another migrant crisis. If grain supplies fall, prices rise, and people flee poverty and hunger. There is a simple calculation here. The more difficult it's for the rest of the world, the more it focuses on ever new problems and challenges, the less pressure will be put on Russia because of the war against Ukraine, according to Moscow's beliefs. But what is happening in Ukraine itself? How will it affect? And what is the mysterious fallback plan B, that we have become aware of? Grain export for Ukraine has traditionally been one of the most important sources of budget replenishment. In pre-war times, even the hryvnia index became stronger when exports received revenue by sending a new crop. In the context of the war, this year the country's budget deficit is about $5 billion a month. Next year, according to the Ministry of Finance of Ukraine, a shortage of $3 billion a month is expected. And under these conditions, grain exports are critically important. We are counting on them in Ukraine. But in order to preserve it, if something similar to what happened now happens again, way back in early September, the same Plan B was developed, which is being implemented by the United States Agency for International Development, USAID. We learned about its firsthand directly from the US officials who oversee the grain deal.
When we deal with Russia, there is always the risk of irresponsible attitude from the Russian side, and it was quite likely that they could break this agreement. Therefore, we have worked very hard not only to unblock the Black Sea ports, which was critical for the world to get access to Ukrainian grain, but also to improve Ukraine's ability to use roads for export needs. Isabel Coleman, USAID Deputy Administrator for Policy and Programming.
As a result, all the time while the export by sea continued, the United States were preparing a fallback. Transportation by trucks on highways, transportation by rail, alternative roads are thought out. They are not disclosed now for security reasons. Yes, in this way it will not be possible to compensate for the entire volume that went by sea, but the country will continue to trade and make money. Does this mean that the Istanbul Treaty is no longer needed? Of course not. And Ukraine and the United States and the European Union will defend it. Yes, Russia will try now, as they say, to squeeze the maximum out of the situation. Bargain, beat out better conditions, ask for the easing of sanctions, which supposedly prevent it from supplying grain for export. Unofficially, we even heard about Moscow's demand to allow the transit of the ammonia through the territory of Ukraine. There is already a pipe for this. Only Ukraine's consent is needed for shipment from the Pivdenny port in Odessa region. So the process is long, but the main thing is that conclusions have been drawn. Ukraine exports will not stop. But how exactly the situation will turn out, what Ukraine might agree to, and what the fundamentally unacceptable, I will tell you about this in our new videos of my author program. Thank you for watching and see you soon.